So today what we're going to be talking about is quantifying the data to continue the DI impact, but diving beyond the metrics. And we came up with this title after you and I were speaking for a little bit. My question to you is, you've been in this industry for 20 years. I'm constantly hearing about the data. The numbers are telling a story. What's the representation of this demographic or this gender? But I know for myself, I'm not a number. I'm an individual. So I'm curious, what do you have to say about metrics matter?
Yeah, no, thanks, Liz. So it's funny. So prior to launching into the diversity space 20 years ago, I was an accountant for KPMG, and I was joking with Linda and Denise before we started that I'm probably the only CPA that's numbers, because I would say for the first 15 years, it was just measuring pipeline and measuring percentages of people coming in, and there was very little focus on inclusion. And equity really never even was in the conversation. And probably the last few years, folks have started to realize that those are really three separate silos. Those are three separate verticals, and that they have to be kind of discussed and handled that way. It's always been D&I as this one entity, one word that's all about the numbers. And so I never talk about I don't set targets, but aspirational goals that we want to have, whether it's to reflect the areas that we're serving or whatever it is. I never have that conversation without talking about the equity and the inclusion piece. And I think that's where a lot of companies stumble, because they say, well, we want to be 35% women in the senior leadership by X number of years or whatever, and that's all. And so they'll go out and they'll beef up their recruiting, and they'll look and identify talent. And they'll talk about looking in different places and identifying diverse talent and bringing that talent in, and they never look behind them to see how quickly that talent is leaving. And so that's the missing piece in that equation. But it's also, and I think it's even worse than that talent leaving, coming in and just disengaging and leaving, is that they disengage and they stay, which I think can be even worse. So you kind of just come in and you just resign to just do the job, 9 to 5, get out. You're not engaged. You're not trying to make that organization better. So I think metrics are important. I have to concede that they're important, but I will never ever talk about metrics in a bubble. When I report out to our governance boards, or anytime you hear me talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, it'll always be kind of the whole story and not just that one part.
Now, you're coming in from left field. You're coming into this position, and you talked about silos. How do you differentiate when they're putting in silo and talking about the numbers beyond people, beyond the why? How do you lay that format and that framework?
Yeah. So again, it's making sure that it's an all-inclusive conversation, and that you're never I will never sit around a table and say, to your point, Luz, nobody wants to come in and be congratulated because you helped us to get to 45%. That's not recognizing a person. That's recognizing a benchmark that you set. And so shifting away from that mentality and that mindset, and just getting leaders and people and individuals to recognize that we are individuals. So one way that I challenge leadership, and a little confrontational, I'll say in my old age, is if they say, okay, we want X% of, or X number of Black males working at the firm, and I say, you get to that number, are you done? Have you succeeded? Because last time I checked, I had a very unique socialization. I had a very unique perspective. And so if you think that 10 Black guys in the room are going to be success, then you're wrong if you're not really leveraging the rest of that. And I realized I did not do my disclaimer, so I don't get in trouble with Natixis, but everything I say is mine, and should not be attributed to Natixis. I look at representation from a gender or an ethnicity perspective, and I think, okay, well, if you've got representation, then that might be half the battle. But the rest of the battle is that representation being included? Does that representation have a seat at the table? Does that representation have a voice? Is that representation engaging? I use an example, and it's semi-controversial, but I'm going to go ahead and put it out there. Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court. Does that mean that we have Black representation on the Supreme Court? And I know we have, Ketanji Brown now, but when you look at Clarence Thomas, does it mean that we should never look to have another Black representative on the Supreme Court? I might say no, because I don't know if Clarence Thomas is representing. And I'm not looking to make this political, but, when you talk about representation, you say, oh, well, we got one, you lose. You lose as an organization. You're not leveraging the positivity that comes from that diverse representation if you're not making sure that they're being included.
That's so powerful, because you just said it, right? I'm not there to say, hey, I'm the number 45th percentile of female Latinas that are being hired. Mm-hmm. Now, with all that diverse viewpoint that you have from the people you're meeting with, the executive team, the managers, the heads of the other departments, how do you bring this into one focal point within a large organization?
It's tough, Luz, I'll be honest. I think a lot of folks think that this is easy work. It's I was looking at I'm a LinkedIn, self-professed LinkedIn junkie, and I was looking at some of the remote D&I opportunities that are posted out there. And I just chuckle, because you'll see like 100% fully remote D&I, head of D&I for some company that I've never heard of. And you see 375 applicants. And I'm just like, I'm laughing at that, because last time I checked, this wasn't work that you could do in a computer screen. It's really that kind of challenging work. And it's not, it's really, I think everybody's looking for that silver bullet, that one hit that's just going to come in and fix everything. And I think that the thing that makes the work so much more intricate and so much more complicated than that is it's a real personal journey. It's a super personal journey. So when you're going in and you're talking about diversity, if I'm presenting to a group of 10 or 10,000, every single person in that room has a story. And so it's really hard to kind of scale it up in like a Men in Black magic pen, push a button, or have a great speaker come in, and that person makes everybody feel good for 10 minutes, and then they're back to acting and reacting the way that they always have, in the way that they've been socialized. So it's hand-to-hand combat in a lot of ways. And folks are like, well, we need something big that's going to come in and it's going to move the needle for everybody, and it's going to happen by next quarter. It doesn't work that way. And so I think shifting, mindsets for leaders in terms of how do you scale? How do you get this to work in a way that's going to be effective and sustainable through the organization? You have to really roll up your sleeves and do the work. And the work means, if it's one person at a time and creating those epiphanies for individuals and helping people to change behaviors one person at a time. That's really where the real traction comes in. I do feel like a lot of organizations, and ones that I've worked with, have, let's get that big name speaker in here, and they're going to say some things, and they're going to sound really good, and people are going to laugh, they're going to cry, they're going to, applaud, and then they're going to go back to their workspace, and they're going to act and behave the exact same way that they have. So I'm not opposed to big speakers. I do think that there's a place for inspiring and raising awareness. But I think it's the rubber really hits the road when you roll up your sleeves, you sit down, you have that very uncomfortable conversation with somebody who maybe doesn't agree or with you and has a very different viewpoint. Doesn't mean that you can't still be friends and you can't still be colleagues and you can't still be effective in how you do your work. But I think we definitely have to have those conversations.
And in keeping aligned with the title, moving beyond the metrics, diving beyond the metrics, how do you know those conversations are making an impact?
It's the tougher thing to measure, and I think it's the reason that most organizations have stayed away from measuring the inclusion and the engagement, because it really is a tough thing to measure. You can look at numbers. Most financial services firms, they like numbers, and they say, okay, well, this is how we run our business. And then you say, well, how do I measure that warm, fuzzy kind of thing that we're talking about? Well, you can look at your attrition. It's always a good indicator, but you can also, there are organizations, and I've worked with some organizations that help to measure and create indices around the inclusive culture that you're always talking about, or cultures in a lot of cases in some organizations. So, finding some of those tools, putting some of those tools in place. I think the other thing is sort of real-time feedback in an environment where you created, as leaders, if you created an environment where people can come to your door and tell you exactly what they're thinking, whether you're going to like it or not, and getting some of that, just creating that kind of environment is perfect. Real-time feedback. There are other tools that, as you're doing something like this, and Luce, I know we talked about potentially bringing in thought exchange to help with this, and, real-time feedback as you're addressing a particular issue, is that you're, running a panel, to be able to see what people are thinking and really helping you to prioritize what's on the mind of the folks that you're dealing with. But I think from a leader's perspective, we just have to create that open door where folks can come in and feel very comfortable saying, you know what, I don't agree. I'll give you a really good example. And again, I guess I am kind of making it political, but I'm not trying to. But I do feel like politics, religion, and race in the last 3 years, or since George Floyd's murder, are topics that before were completely taboo. Like, you didn't even consider bringing those into the workspace. You came in, you put the uniform on, you did your work, and then you went home and you fell apart, and you dealt with all of the different things that were going on. I am determined to figure out a way to bring those topics into the workforce, because I think it's super important that we find a way to have those conversations. So one very subtle thing that I do is I keep a picture behind me, and you might not be able to make it out, but it's a picture with, and Luce, I know we talked about this, it's a picture with Obama, because I know that like half the country doesn't support the fact that Obama was president. So yes, we will have that conversation subtly if you want to. And that's what I do. It's, sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's, right at it. But I do think that is what we need to be doing. We need to be having those professionally uncomfortable conversations and recognizing that we don't have to hate each other or never speak to each other or never have coffee or lunch or any of those things. And that's hard to do. It's really hard to do. And so finding ways for our employees to do that, finding ways for our leaders to do that, because I think leaders kind of tend to walk that, I'm not going to pick a side, I'm just going to kind of walk down the middle and tightrope this, and it doesn't work. And so finding ways to have those professionally uncomfortable conversations in the work environment, I think is critical to moving this work forward.
No, I appreciate your candor. It's what I'm hearing is we're moving away from conformity into authenticity. And a lot of organizations don't know how that looks. So their focus is on numbers alone. And we want to bring them back to, what does authenticity look like? And it starts by being uncomfortable.
Yeah, no, definitely. And so leading by example. So I always share my story, and I won't cannibalize this session to share the story, but I will say that, like, to get leaders to get comfortable with that uncomfortable and that vulnerability, I always lead by example. And my story is my story. And so I share that. I share that internally. I share that externally. Super humble beginnings, actually here in Boston where I'm sitting, and, to where I'm sitting now. And all of that is part of my journey. What drives me to do this? And the question that I ask everyone in any format or session that I get in is, what's your why? What's your why? Because I'm constantly asking myself, what's my why? Why do I even care? Why not just sit back and collect a paycheck and put out some buzzwords? And why do I care that this work have like impact and better outcomes? Because I know that it will create better just environments within the financial service. We've got research that says that diverse and inclusive teams outperform in the S&P. So why can't we get there? Well, there's something else wrong. I think it's because we're not telling our stories.
And we're focused on the diverse, not the inclusive.
Yes. Denise, I didn't know if you were just like giving me
Nope, nope, nope. I got questions. People are blowing up my private chat
Awesome.
here. So,
Let's go for it.
so lots and lots. Some of them are public, some of them are private. So I'm going to start with a couple of the more private ones. You've talked about kind of the quantifiable side of it, of being able to count people and what does that mean, et cetera. Well, if we're not really holding up the standard of the numbers, how do you actually measure whether inclusion is working in the environment? And in particular, at some point, you and I have to have a long conversation about hybrid, because I actually do think it can be done, but that's another conversation. But so start with that, and then if you can, then the next series of questions go around boundaries, but I'll bring those questions back up. But how do you measure when inclusion is actually working?
Yeah, and so again, it's a trickier one. And I'm not saying throw away the metrics of the numbers and the sort of the aspirational goals, but just cannot be standalone. I think for the inclusion, there's a lot of different ways that you can kind of measure whether or not it's working. So if your company has ERGs, which we do, you can measure it through the engagement. You know, if they're hosting sessions that are really, you know, and beyond, I'm not anti Heritage Months either, but if they're doing sessions that are really kind of drawing people in and creating conversations and just, you know, creating some of that discomfort that we're talking about, that's a measure. People aren't going to come out and spend time on things that, like, you know, are outside of that 9 to 5. So I think that's one measure. If folks are coming to your door and having very candid, open, honest conversations. I had an intern come to me this morning or late last night, and we had done a piece where we were highlighting our scholarship recipients. We had awarded scholarships for underrepresented, and an intern who came to me and said, you know, one of those recipients who's now interning with us really took offense with the tone of the article, because it sounded like, you know, hooray for Natixis and this poor little unfortunate, you know, it was just framed. And so they felt comfortable bringing that to me. That to me is measuring some of the inclusion. So, you know, that transparent, that open sort of culture that you talk about, like not being afraid to voice things that maybe are going to be uncomfortable, I think is another measure of inclusion. Your engagement surveys are another way to measure whether or not folks are really feeling, you know, connected to an organization. And then I think beyond the surveys, it's what you do with the feedback that you get from those. So how are you creating and working to make that even better? So yeah, those are some of the things. And then the real-time feedback from doing sessions like this where, you know, we're fielding questions through the chat, and I see them now, Denise, all the questions that are loading up in there. But, you know, real-time feedback. So if somebody poses a comment or statement, and then others are able to sort of opine or vote on that statement, you start to see priority. Like, you know what? There are 28, 29 comments or chat comments in there, and I can't see them all. And then everybody's looking at those 29 comments, and they're saying, you know what? This one really resonates with me. This one really resonates. You'll see that one start to bubble to the top. So it gives you an opportunity to prioritize as well. So when you're starting to think about, okay, how are we going to develop this inclusive culture? It's not just this is what we think from the ivory tower, but it's like, here's what we're hearing and here's what's resonating with people. So
okay. That leads us kind of into these open conversations, because clearly you've done a lot in terms of creating an open environment. Well, we've got a number of people who are asking a question similar to this. Most places, they're not in a, they don't feel comfortable asking tough questions. They don't want to be in that, because, you know, all corporations, all businesses are politics, right? It's about people getting along. How do you figure out how to facilitate those respectful conversations, even if they're uncomfortable? And sometimes, you know, there's triggers afterwards where people don't feel comfortable talking, or you said something that I didn't appreciate, or, you know, we're not all going to be great orators in the process. As you've been pulling this together, and it sounds like you've done some really, really fabulous work, can you tell us a little bit of how you overcame the reluctance of people engaging in tough conversations Many people use, crucial conversations, et cetera, but they still get stuck in this. What did you do differently?
I led. I told it first. I did my part first. So I told my story first, whether it was my story. So, for example, so I was with another financial service institution when George Floyd was murdered. And a lot of organizations were doing listening sessions and different dialogues and different things like that. I put together some work where, yes, we did the same thing, and coordinating with the different business line leaders, so whether it was banking or equities or futures or fixed income, and talking them through, okay, we want to do this. We want to create this platform, this place where people can really talk about how they're feeling about what's going on with the racial unrest and with George Floyd's murder. And they were all for it. They were all for it. They were all like, yes, that's great. We definitely should do that. You got my, sign off. I said, wait, no, but I'm going to tell how I'm feeling. And it's not going to be scripted. It's not going to be, pen and paper kind of oratory. And then you're going to talk about how you're feeling around this. And I will tell you, so it was in that situation, it was two white males, two white females, hemmed and hawed around that. I'm not talking about this. This is to your point, Denise, very I'm not going to do that. There was a lot of coaching that went into going into those sessions for those leaders. There was a lot of one-on-one time that I spent with them about their stories and, their socialization around race and how they wanted it to show up and reflect within their work teams before we were able to have those conversations. But then the conversations themselves they weren't scripted. Some of them did write down kind of points that they wanted to make during that conversation that they had with their teams. And I got that. But when we got into those sessions, I can tell you that without exception, all four of them got emotional in front of their teams. So when I say emotional, one person said, 15 minutes before the session, well, I don't want to cry. I was like, well, if crying is what's going to happen, then let it happen. Let your folks see who you are. And they did. And I can tell you the feedback that we got from that, just that vulnerability from those leaders was amazing. Was amazing. But my story is, with George Floyd and the murder of George Floyd and being a Black man in America and specifically sitting in Boston right now, I talked about that. I talked about, being pulled over back in the 80s, and I'll date myself a little bit, and having my pager smashed by the police because I was an assumed drug dealer, and then having to go to work at the residential treatment facility where I was working with kids and explain that I needed another pager because, Black man, I must be a drug dealer. Things like that. Being able to tell some of that just frustrating, the stuff again that you would put up the screen, go to work. Nobody would ever know that you're dealing with this stuff, because you just, you're bottled up like this the whole time you're at work. And then you walk out and you're dealing with all kinds of things. And so leading with my own story, making sure leaders are telling their story and not just putting the onus on the employee base, I think is a critical kind of piece to making this better. I'm not going to say making it perfect, but making it better.
Ron, this is Luce again. And I'm so happy that you shared with us a little bit of your journey and your process. It was never super simple and guided, and here's the rule book on how to do it, but you just really had to trial and error. And we have a guest who's asking, she's in the construction industry and she's working to advance the DEI in the corporate setting and in the construction job sites. Mm-hmm. As you can imagine, she's had some pushback and some difficulties. Now, her question would be, how do we help facilitate respectful dialogue?
It has to be, it has to be respectful. That's the thing. It's like, they're not going to go in and generate to like a shouting match or chairs throwing across the room. You have to set the guidelines up front with those conversations and be very clear. And again, you're in a professional setting, you're doing something that's new for most people, but you have to put up those guardrails and just, this is going to be professionally uncomfortable. And so, and you need and the other thing is I wouldn't just leave something like this to your ERG leads. Unless they're facilitating, they're trainers and have been, trained in sort of facilitation. I think if you don't feel as a D&I practitioner that you're comfortable going in and facilitating those sessions, then you find somebody out there, a vendor or a consultant or somebody who has been doing this and can come in and facilitate those conversations. But it's tough. And I'll give you another real example. And some of you may have, had this going on in your organizations as well. But Roe v. Wade, and there were two different things that we as a leadership team talked about it a lot, and our folks came to us with their opinions on what we were supposed to do and public statements and this and that, and so we were kind of like, okay, there's two things to this. There's our policy and there's our people. And so we had some folks saying, well, we need to put out a statement saying this side. We need to put out a statement saying this side. And it's like, we can't do that. Natixis doesn't have that stamp. Natixis is its people. And so we needed to make sure that we were creating that platform, that respectful platform that recognized that our people came and had different ideas and different opinions and different viewpoints on Roe v. Wade. Now, I have my personal, but I didn't think that would be fair, and neither did our CEO, to say, well, here's my personal belief on this, and this is how you should address it. But really, it was more about making sure that we recognize that there were different viewpoints on this, and that we were creating a platform and a space where folks felt comfortable doing and having those conversations. So working with our employee resource group here, we are going to have a conversation, and normally I would have done that more closer to sort of real time, but it's super sensitive. And so we are really kind of making sure that when we're having that conversation, we're providing that platform, that it does feel like that safe space for everyone to sort of voice their opinion and their concern. So
that's great. On a similar note, I'm Hispanic. As you know, it's coming out, people are liking to be called Latinx, or there's a Latine or Latina or Latino. And some organizations are asking, what should we name ourselves? And how do you maneuver something like that in alignment with what you just stated? How do you have that reach out or touching base with the people out there to state different views?
Yeah, I think that there's probably a missed opportunity there. Where I think a lot of folks will get into the ivory tower and make decisions and not realize that they've got this whole employee base to kind of help them with those decisions. So if that were my dilemma or the challenge that I was facing, I'd probably ask Luz, or I'd ask the ERG. And it shouldn't be 10 people, 12 people sitting around a conference table deciding because they've got titles of leaders. Now, granted, yes, they are responsible for the business, but they also have to realize that they have this incredible employee base that if they're really empowered, they'll get what they need. And I wasn't here in 2020, but I did hear how the leadership leveraged the ERG that was in place to ideas on how do we make this better? How do we respond as an organization? And so, yeah, you have to tap into. I'm not a fan personally of Latinx, and I think when you look back at it and where it came from and how it just makes it easier for a lot of folks to kind of just lump. It's not as triggering for me as someone who says I don't see color, but it's in that ballpark. It's kind of like we have to make sure that we're taking the time, we're slowing down, getting to know who people are, why they are, what their why is. And so all of the shortcuts, or some of the shortcuts that are being created in the D&I space, I don't necessarily agree with, because I don't think that gets us to better outcomes. I think it just makes us more comfortable and makes it easier for us to not address some of the things that need to be addressed.
Now, you said something interesting. It was around sensitivity. Some things trigger you, something doesn't trigger you as much. When there's such a spectrum of sensitivity, and this is to a private question that was asked, how do you handle or approach someone who's really sensitive from your subjective opinion?
I'm still figuring it out. It's really case by case. It's you would be surprised the conversations I've had and some of the I've been yelled at in a professional work setting. I've been, email cursed out and told, that I'm tone deaf, and so I know that these issues aren't easy issues for a lot of people. But what I really, again, and I keep coming back to, just trying to keep that objective open. I'm not going to cancel you because, you're so far left or so far right that we'll never kind of be able to meet in the middle. You still will not be canceled. So I think it is really a case by case. And going back to my earlier point of the hand-to-hand combat, there's no kind of silver bullet or magic wand that says, okay, now everybody just do this, and we'll all be playing nice in the D&I sandbox. So, yeah, tough one. I wish it were easy. If it were easy, I wouldn't still be doing this work. I'd be retired on the beach somewhere. But it's hard work.
Mhm.
No, and I appreciate your candor, because it's true. We're thinking that we're never going to get talked back to, or, talk badly to, but I appreciate you sharing that information. And I do want to open it up to everybody else in the audience. Would you like to unmute yourself, share some questions, and get some insights from Ron while we have him here?
Yeah. Before you do that, I'll just say I've already been yelled at twice today. So if you're going to unmute to yell at me, you're going to have to get in line.
It looks like Kim has her hand up. Kim, feel free to come off mute. There you go.
Hi, thank you so much. This is really, really great content. So I work for a healthcare organization here in San Diego, California. And one of the things I've been working on is affinity groups, or ERGs, related to DEI. And I just heard you say that you don't suggest leaving the facilitation of those to leads that are staff, that you suggest having a outside party come in. Well, I think our plan right now is to leave it to the staff, and I'm charged with kind of preparing those leads to have these conversations. And I don't know that they want to. I don't know that's going to be valuable, but I have to go back to my corporate vice president on this. So any thoughts, suggestions that I can present to him about affinity groups and ERGs? Thanks.
Yeah, and you say so you're planning to have them facilitate some of these difficult, uncomfortable conversations. We put so much on our employees. We put so much on our employees, and I know a couple of years ago, LinkedIn actually announced that they were going to pay their ERG leads $10,000 a year, and a lot of folks were like, "Well, that's great." I think it was the recognition more so than the 10. Well, the $10,000's not bad either, but I think it's just the recognition of how much we put on our ERG leads. So yeah, I would say think about it, Kim, and really kind of, if there are consultants or folks that maybe you could have some conversations with. It's a tough thing to lead. Of course, you're coming from a personal place. If it's, if it's something that is personal to them. But sometimes I question the fairness of that. It's an emotionally draining, and you said healthcare. So, it's an emotionally draining situation.
Yeah. And these are nurses. These are, other people who already, like you said, are doing a lot, and they're just trying to help. But this is on top of their job,
Yeah. No, and I facilitate these sessions, and like I said, I share my own story. I get emotional sometimes when I'm sharing my story. I can tell you, and I'm an introvert, which nobody believes, because they say you talk way too much to be an introvert. But after those sessions, without fail, I am curled up and I'm just recovering, because it is lights off. Just leave me alone. Don't talk to me. Turn off the phones, because it is emotionally exhausting and draining to do those sessions. So if you are, considering having your ERG leads lead those sessions, I would just say take that really into consideration.
Mm-hmm.
And Darla, you had a question too about reflective structured dialogue.
Yes, I'm just curious if you've ever I've been in a session where reflective structured dialogue was used to address issues of diversity. It was a very effective communication model. And so just curious if you've ever used that, or what you think about that model.
All right, tell me more about the model. Tell me how that works. And
Sure. So it was done by a professional mediator who came in, and this was with the leadership group in the town where I live. And we sat in a circle. They posed, our topic was racism. And I live in the deep South, and so it was a very difficult conversation or topic to address, but very necessary. So we sat in a circle. You pose a question around the topic. So here's an example. What was your first experience with racism? And you always talk from a first person perspective. It's never about anybody else. It's always about you. And you use I in your communication method. So you have 2 minutes to write down on a piece of paper what your answer is. And then the facilitator takes you around the circle. You have 2 minutes to share your answer. And you can pass or you can share. It's completely whatever you feel comfortable with. And there were really clear set of boundaries. So you couldn't nod your head. You couldn't shake your head. You couldn't you couldn't roll your eyes. Your nonverbals had to be very clean. You had to listen. It was like a forced listening lesson. It was fabulous. And then you wrote your questions down based on whatever person, their experience, and you wanted to know more. And at the end of that session, you would then open up the floor for questions, and it always had to be in a question format. It could never be a statement, because the purpose of reflective structured dialogue is to create dialogue. And the only way to do that is to ask, I think, coaching questions that dig deeper. And it created more questions and more understanding. And it was a really safe environment to have a very difficult conversation.
I like that. I love that, Darla. So I guess yes, but more indirectly. But I'm curious, was it a diverse group? And I'm assuming it was a smaller group. You said about
it was
10.
very diverse. Yes.
Yeah. No, I love that. So if I structure that, so I'm always asking questions. I'm always, want to know what folks' stories are. So when I do sessions, and I do prefer smaller sessions, there's a lot of that kind of, let's just take the guards down. A lot of it happens one-on-one too, but I like that you're able to kind of do that reflective dialogue in that setting. So I may borrow a little more of the structure.
You can look it up on the internet, reflective structured dialogue.
Yeah,
and I loved it because it was with a group of people I've been with for a few months in a collaborative leadership growth environment. And so we'd already had a deep relationship and connected before we went. It's kind of like levels of communication, right? You don't just jump into the deep level. You build on certain criteria and then you go deep.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Darla. Really appreciate it. Anyone else have any questions or comments?
I wanted to jump on after what Kim mentioned, and what reminded me is I had a conversation with Ron, and he talked to me about when his leadership had open door policies. Can you talk a little bit more about open door policies and what you did around that?
Is that for me or Kim?
For you, Ron.
Yeah, I'm fortunate with Natixis because the leaders really do kind of, and just to give you some background, so I actually live in central New Jersey with my wife and our 16-year-old daughter and our Siberian Husky and my mother-in-law. And so every Sunday I jump on a plane and I come up to Boston and I spend the week here. So Sunday to Thursday with Natixis. And the reason I do that is because I do believe that this leadership team really, truly does want to get this right. When I met with the CEO, first of all, they had it positioned correctly, which I think is another miss for a lot of companies in terms of where they position D&I. It's usually embedded within HR somewhere under talent management. So even when they were out looking to fill this role, which I'm the initial person to come into this role, they already had it positioned correctly. So that was one thing that kind of got me going, I'll take a look at that. But it was in Boston. I'm in central Jersey. And I'm like, well, and I came up and I met with each of the leadership team members individually over 2 days, starting with that CEO. And I would say in my 20 years of doing this work, I probably have met 3 CEOs that I felt like I would work for free. However, Linda, I'm going to need you to cut that from the recording. Cannot have him hearing that. Don't want him to know that I would work for free. But he just had that inquisitive, he's curious, he was asking questions. He talked about his vision for DE&I, and it was just like, yeah, I could do that. I could do that. So when you think of an open door policy, they have, and I'll give you a real example of that with the CEO. So we had our intern start a few weeks ago, and we've got about 20, just under 20 interns that started. These are college level interns. And so I did a session with them, and I'm always like, after the session, if you want, just reach out, set up some time. So of the 20, I've already, and this was last week, I've already met with 8 of them who reached out individually after. David, our CEO, did the same thing. He did a session, he had a breakfast meeting with them, and he did the same thing. He put it out there. He said, if you want anything, so he's already met with 4. And we're trying to kind of dial him back for him just because he's a little busier than I am, but he is so open to just sitting down. And we're trying to protect him. And he's like, no, I want to talk to you. I want to talk to everybody. And so he makes the time. And I just think that is open door policy in action. When you think about it, the CEO who's going to sit down with an intern who's been here for 2-3 weeks and learn more about them and talk about the organization and give them some tips and tricks and things like that. And so to me, that is open door policy in action. A lot of folks say it and then close their doors. Just doesn't work. So.
And we have 5 minutes left. I think Susan had a comment. If you want to unmute yourself, Susan.
This Susan? I love the fact that you really focus on the open conversations, and it has to be taken from the point of view of each individual, because everybody's experiences are so unique that you can try to make it about the collective, but you still have to look at each one of us and what we've been through in life, how we've experienced different interactions in order to really have it come together in a powerful way. Thank you, Ron.
No, thank you, Susan. Thank you for that. I don't know, I see 40 comments in the chat. I'm dying to open them up and just start reading them and ignore y'all and just start diving into them. But
actually, I think Kushan, you had a comment and a question. So I don't know if you can come off mute or not, but if you can, that would be lovely. All right. Anyone else have any last minute comments or questions? Any insights you'd like to share with everyone? This has been a really, I hope, thought-provoking conversation. It certainly has for me, but does anyone have any thoughts, Jennifer or Deborah or Gwendolyn? Any comments, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'll say something since you're providing the opportunity. Thank you, Linda. One of the most important things I can say, at least in my journey, is don't be afraid to have the uncomfortable conversations, and don't be afraid to apologize if you inadvertently step on somebody's toes or say the wrong thing. And I think if you lead with that, this may not come out right. I'm not quite sure how to ask this or broach this subject with you, but I really want to have the conversation. I find that people are willing to have that conversation with you. If you're vulnerable, then they will return the favor.
That's such a great point, Jennifer. And I tell folks all the time that not saying anything or just letting something go can be worse than saying the wrong thing. So framing it, this is not going to be easy for me. I've never had this conversation. However you frame it, you have to do that. But if you go silent on your employees, like a lot of companies did during George Floyd, during Roe v. Wade, during Uvalde, whatever. And I know you can't comment on everything, but if you don't create that sort of culture of, hey, we're going to talk and we're going to mess up, we're going to say the wrong thing, we might do the wrong thing, but we're going to keep going and we're going to keep looking to be better, and setting that as your platform, then you've lost already.
Talk about diving beyond the metrics. Thank you so much, Ron. Is there anyone else who would like to share a thought or a question? We have 2 minutes to go. If not, then we can say thank you so much, a warm welcome. Yes, thank you so much. And please, I put your link, Ron, so people can connect with you on LinkedIn, because you
Yes.
are a LinkedIn junkie. I know the moment I texted him, he responded right away, and he has like thousands of friends and connections on LinkedIn. So thank you so much, Ron, for joining us. And
I really want to thank you, Luz. So thank you so much, Luz, for facilitating such a terrific conversation. Thank you, Denise, for leading us, and Susan for being part of our Leadership Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council. Ron, you, as I knew you would, provided a really thought-provoking, incredibly insightful conversation. And I appreciate all of you being here today for the Leadership Global Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Roundtable. As Denise noted, this happens every single month, so feel free to mark your calendars now through December at the same date and time every single month. So really appreciate all of you being a part of today's conversation. All of you, because you registered, will receive a follow-up email from me with a recording of today's conversation. So an edited recording of today's conversation with the resources that Ron noted and his contact information should you want to reach out and have a deeper dive into issues that you may be facing regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion in your own business or your own practice. So really do appreciate everyone's time and attention and being a part of today's conversation, and really, really appreciate you carving out the time to explore this incredibly, I think, nuanced and complex but important aspect of diversity, equity, and inclusion across all groups. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a beautiful rest of your week and a wonderful weekend. And we'll see you this time, this date, next month. Thank you so much.
Thanks, man.